My name is Evaggelos Vallianatos. I live in Claremont, California, and the history I'm going to tell you this evening, it's about the Antikythera Mechanism, which is really the culmination of all sorts of centuries of study the stars and growing and advancing science and technology in ancient Greece, primarily in the post-Alexander the Great era. That is, the headquarters of that knowledge and development was Alexandria, Egypt today. Used to be the capital of the Greek state of Egypt, and we're talking about the 2nd century before Common Era. That's 2,200 years ago. In order to understand why the Greeks reached that level of almost advanced science and technology 2,200 years ago, we need to know something about Aristotle. Aristotle was a great philosopher, probably the greatest philosopher ever. And he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle, not only he addressed philosophical questions, and he wrote about everything almost, from the stars to politics to poetry, all sorts of other issues, but he also invented what we know today as the science of zoology. So with all that knowledge, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great, and he taught the young man to govern and to love and to embrace the search for knowledge and the search for the truth. So when Alexander became the king of Egypt, the king of a gigantic empire, his general in Egypt, Ptolemaeus, he created 2 institutions that were the foundation for all this. One was called Museum, which is the equivalent of a university, and the other was a library, which became the largest library in the ancient world. And then the king of Egypt, Ptolemaeus, he funded the best minds of the time, philosophers, astronomers, mathematicians, to study the cosmos and to study politics and to study the editing of ancient Greek manuscripts like the works of Homer, for instance. And out of that turmoil and encouraging advancement of science, they came up with the idea of trying to create a machine that would predict the eclipses of the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon, of course, were part of the cosmos, and they were especially important because they defined the day and night, they defined the month, they defined the year. So the Greeks felt that they had to know when these stars would disappear from the heavens. That's what eclipses mean. And in order to do that, they, in the island of Rhodes, we suspect, under the supervision of an astronomer called Hipparchus, they put together this marvel of technology made out of gears. And by the way, the gears we know today were the gears they put in this machine. And the picture shows the complexity of the gear work within this extraordinary calculating machine, which was like a laptop computer of what we have today. And it is a predictive machine. In other words, the gears could do mathematics, and they had the advanced knowledge of astronomy by Hipparchus, and before him, of course, they had the mathematics of Archimedes. Archimedes was a genius in mathematics and engineering, and all that knowledge was more or less circulating during this period, and they managed to create this fantastic machine. I came across this in 2007 in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. I saw the fragments, that is, and I was so startled, so astonished. I had a doctor's degree in history, and I had never heard of anything like this. The professors, when I was taking history classes, yes, they praised the Greeks for doing all sorts of things with democracy and science and so on, but they never said that the Greeks had any kind of a form of advanced technology. So seeing the evidence in front of my eyes really shocked me, to the point that I said I need to find out how they did it. So I wrote a book about this, and before I get to the book, I started reading, I started going back to the mythological, astronomical, and political developments of the ancient Greeks, before and, of course, after Alexander the Great. But the key to this, as I already explained, is 2, Aristotle and Alexander the Great, because they set up the foundations, that is, the intellectual foundations of why it was necessary to follow and to advance science and technology. So this mechanism, what did they do with it? This mechanism was designed to predict primarily the eclipses of the sun and the moon. And it did it, and it could do it in the future and in the past. So it was like a real computer. And you can see from the picture in front of you how complex the gears work with each other. Now, 1/3 of the mechanism was lost because they discovered it accidentally in 1950 meters under the water in the sea, very close to this tiny little island called Antikythera. And therefore, the people at the museum, when they got the fragments, they didn't know what to do with it, so they called it Antikythera Mechanism. But it has taken over 120 years of intensive scientific research to understand this and find out what it could do and how it could do what it did. And the research, by the way, continues to this very day. And the scientists are very much in agreement that this is the most advanced technology anybody in the ancient world ever developed. And not only that, but it was so advanced that it was about 2,000 years ahead of its time. So one of the Americans that visited the museum in Athens and he saw the fragments, this was Clark. He used to write science fiction. At any rate, he looked at the fragments just like I looked at them in 207, and he wondered, he said, let's assume that the Greeks continued to do that work and they were not interrupted. Where would we be today? We, by we, he meant the Western and other people all over the world. And he concluded, he answered his own question, he said, not only we would have gone to the moon, but maybe we would have gone to the nearest stars. And I want to add to that and say, not only that, but we wouldn't, in other words, if the Greeks had been allowed to continue with their investigations and to continue advancing this technology, number one, there would be no Roman Empire. And of course, without Roman Empire, you cannot have Christianity, you cannot have Islam, you cannot have any of the abominations of the Dark Ages with crusading armies and all the Dark Ages that dropped the level of intelligence and the level of knowledge to practically zero, out of very advanced levels to almost zero. And the books, people in the Dark Ages ended up having the Bible and a few hymns as their main books, because the Christians wiped out Greek culture. They burned books, libraries that is, they smashed the Parthenon, they smashed all the temples all over the country. And all the books we have, it's just, that is, if you go to a classics library, you have about 1,000 volumes, which reflects about 1% of what really existed in the Library of Alexandria, let's say, in the 3rd century BCE. This is pretty much, therefore, overview of the machine, the political reality of Alexander, and the political reality and the philosophical and scientific reality of Aristotle, and then Archimedes, and then Euclid, and then Hipparchus created this fantastic machine. And it's too bad that other forces intervened and human progress more or less was disrupted, destroyed, and for a whole 1,000 years, humanity lived in what historians call the Dark Ages. So what kind of lessons do we learn from this? I would certainly recommend that you pick up my book and read it. I spent about 10 years writing this book to investigate the history of science and technology and the politics of the time in order to reach to the level that they could create this. Dear Tony, can you please put some more pictures on the screen?
Are you seeing them?
I only see the first one with the gears. I sent you about a dozen. Can you please put some more? Replace this one with the... Okay, let's stop right here. This is a reproduction of the machine by a mathematician in Athens, Dionysios Kriaris. And what this is the front part of the computer. And the front part of the computer shows that what looks like a yellow gold noble. They call it the gear of the sun, SUN. And the front part is pretty much where the pointers exist or existed to point to where the different planets were. Because this machine not only predicts the eclipse of the sun and the moon, but it gives you a maps of the heavens. That is, it tells you where the sun and the moon and the planets are located, including also some of the major constellations. Now, if you please reverse, give me the other picture of the other side of this machine. Tony? Okay.
What about this one?
This one. Okay, yeah. What do you see this, right, the two circles, they look like two circles. The upper one is called the metonic dial, let's call it that, metonic dial, and it's a 19-year calendar, 223, 19 years calendar. It's a very exact calendar. What the ancients had discovered was that every 19 years, the stars exist in the same spot in the heavens. And the dial on the very bottom is the 18-year, 222 months Saros calendar, which is the predictive dial of this machine. Here is where the prediction takes place. And the machine had the capability to let you know exactly when you're going to expect to see an eclipse of the sun or the moon. In other words, this machine was very simple. It didn't run on electricity, obviously. And you can see the knob on the side. You took the knob, you turn it right until you stop at a point that you wanted to see what was going on in the heavens. And immediately it will tell you the position of the stars, that is the position of the moon and the position of the other planets. Plus, it would also tell you the possible prediction of the eclipse of the sun and the moon. And so this is the backside of the computer. And it's fantastic because not only it did predict the phenomena in the heavens, but it also predicted some important events in Greek life. And the most important of all, of course, was the Olympics and the other Pan-Hellenic Games. The Greeks did not need a computer to know that the Olympics would take place because the Olympics took place every 4 years. And there were other minor Olympic-like events that took place every 2 years. But anyway, the computer joined the heavens and the earth in this manner, which is why this computer was so important. And it must have been tremendously popular all over the Greek world. And regrettably, the only one they have discovered up to now has been this. And it was discovered, as I said, in 1900, deep in the waters of the island of Antikythera. So the question that some people have asked me, and of course I asked myself a long time ago, whatever happened to the rest? If this was so popular, and it was used for chronological, for political and other events, why did it disappear almost? I said, again, the question is that there was a dramatic reversal of culture in the 4th century. That is, the Roman Emperor Constantine, he embraced this new religion out of Judaism, which received the name of Christianity, and that religion was enforced on the people, on the Greeks especially. And as a result, they began to smash and destroy everything. And if you live in that period of time, let's say in the 6th century AD, and you knew that you had a computer, but if somebody discovered that you had a computer that was dated back to the 2nd century, and therefore you would be branded as a heathen, you melted it down, you destroyed it, you smashed it, you threw it away. And this is what happens. This is why these things disappear. We have a lot of scholars, of course, have written about this machine. There are several books, including mine, about this Antikythera Mechanism. And I must tell you that all the other people except me have claimed that this was simply a recycling process. And I don't agree with that at all. It was not recycling at all. It was the fact of the political reality of the new religion and the hatred against Hellenic ideas and science that terrified the people that owned them, and they discarded them, and so they almost disappear. So this is it. And now, Tony, can you please find some of the fragments? You remember I sent you a couple of pictures of hey, that's it. Okay, let's stay with this. This fragment is the main quill in the very front of the machine, and you can see, if you have a good eyesight, you can see the tiny little teeth. Now, each of this tooth is about 1 millimeter in size, and its gear is about the size of a quarter. You have $1 and you have 4 quarters. So you were talking about minute device. And the question is, how did they manage to do all this extremely sophisticated technological work in such a minute scale? Did they have a way to miniaturize this? I don't know. But anyway, it's just simply another way of saying that this was a form of advanced technology. And the other point about advanced technology is the following. The Greeks knew that at least Hipparchus, the philosopher, he was also a philosopher, but he was an astronomer primarily, who supervised the creation of this machine in Rhodes. He knew that the moon moves around the Earth in an elliptical trajectory, like this, elliptical trajectory. It was not the perfect circle that the Greeks thought. Most of the movements were perfect. Had to be a circle. So elliptical trajectory. So they reproduced that elliptical trajectory in the machine itself. And how did they do that? They took two gears. They put one over the other, and there was a kind of a tiny little pin and slot device or mechanism that united the two gears. And while the gear on the bottom moved at a steady speed, the gear on the top moved sometimes faster and then slower to represent exactly the movement of the moon around the Earth. The moon, when it's closer to the Earth, is going pretty fast. But the moon, when it's very far from the Earth, it moves slower. So they managed to do exactly that natural movement into the computer itself. This is why the computer is really a marvel of advanced technology, so far ahead of its time that it's just almost unbelievable. And I recommend some of you who are interested not just to read a book, but also to take a look at the works of Archimedes, for instance, this great mathematician in Syracuse, how he managed for 2 years he used his knowledge of technology to create weapons, and with those weapons, he defended Syracuse from an onslaught by Romans. And eventually, a local Greek, unfortunately, he valued the gold more than anything else. So he went to the Romans and he saw them a secret path. They go into Syracuse, and of course, they slaughtered Archimedes and they killed most men. And they did the typical barbaric stuff when you conquer Polis, a city. And that's how we know. But Archimedes, however, his work was so popular, so widespread, that we are happy to report that we have at least 50 to 60% of what he actually wrote. And if you just take a look at his mathematics, it's just a marvel. I'm not a mathematician, but I grew up in my high school. I studied Archimedes, and the mathematics I learned were from Euclid and Archimedes. And so it's just a fantastic kind of prototype. So the people who created the mechanism in the 100 years after Archimedes, or something like that, they had already the knowledge of Archimedes. So the closer you can say the intellectual father of this mechanism is probably Archimedes, and the real father is probably, use the word probably because we are really not 100% certain. I mean, there are historical reports about this mechanism, but of course the ancient Greeks did not call this Antikythera Mechanism. They might have called it a tablet. And another one is metereoscopion, which was the word that Ptolemy, the great astronomer of the 2nd century of our own times, he described mechanisms that appear to me, at least, they resemble that of the Antikythera mechanism. So this metereoscopion probably was the name of this mechanism in ancient times, not the Antikythera mechanism as we know it today. So with this, and finally, Tony, can you please put the pictures that have the fragments, the many fragments and the 7 fragments? So that
Sure can. Hold on, please. I'll just keep talking while I do that. Hold on.
Yeah. You need it. The visual part is very important. If you see something and you hear also a discussion of it, you understand it easier than just simply listen to a theoretical discussion of it. Not that we saw this one. Keep going. That's it. Okay. Stay with this for a second. These are the 7 largest fragments of the mechanism. The one that is named Alpha A on the very left is the largest. It's the kind of the governing gear of the mechanism. When they first discovered it, of course, they didn't have the technology to understand what. They looked at this and they did not know what to say. Indeed, for 6 months or more, this mechanism was dumped into a kind of in a corner of the museum, and they didn't know what to do with it. And finally, an archaeologist saw a few Greek letters, and he saw what appeared to be like teeth of a mechanism, the teeth of a gear. So he examined it more carefully, and then he figured this was something strange. And then the official studies began in 1902, 1910, and then you had, finally we come to the middle century, 1950s, 60s, 70s, when a guy from the UK, Derek de Sola Price, who I respect tremendously, unfortunately he died. He used to be a professor of the history of science at Yale University, and he went back and forth from Yale to Athens. And after 16 years of study, he published a report. He called it Gears from the Greeks. And I recommend that you take a look at it. And it's just a marvel of understanding. This man really understood this mechanism. But again, he himself, the most advanced technology he had was X-rays, and the X-rays they had in 1950s and 60s were not as advanced as what we have today with the imaging technologies. So they could see some of the interior, they could see that beyond the surface there were all sorts of complicated stuff with something that you could not see with naked eyes. And so this is how the whole technology developed. And then finally, we come to 2005, where a group of scientists headed by another British mathematician, Tony Freeth, he brought Greeks and Germans and Americans together, and he convinced two gigantic foreign companies, one from the United States and one from the UK, and they all went to Athens. And the UK company looked at the interior, X-Tech, the name of the company. They looked at the interior and then they photographed the interior of the mechanism. And that's how we began to understand the complexity of the gear work. And the American company, they used a dog with lights, each light flashing at a different angle. So by the time they took the pictures, they could actually see something that was invisible by naked eye. And that's how they began to see the inscriptions. Because this mechanism, not only it had all these gears, but it had a kind of a guidebook. So if you took it, you would actually look at the guidebook, in other words, read the inscriptions, and the inscriptions would tell you that if you do this, you're going to see this kind of constellation in the sky. You may have this kind of eclipse of the sun and the moon. And it's marvelous. They have tried to decipher, and they did decipher, a substantial amount of the written work, because the written work was so tiny and embedded into the metal. And after 2,000 years in the water, you can imagine the erosion and you can imagine the destruction. So as I said, 1/3 of the mechanism is completely lost, so that with what was remaining, it was, anyway, they have resurrected the dead pretty much with this imaging technology. And that's how I am so excited, and I speak about it, and I wrote this book, because the information is dramatic. If you read the inscriptions and then you have the pictures, the X-ray pictures and the imaging pictures of the interior and the outside, and you have the fantastic calendar and the predictive mechanism in the back about the ESRs and so on, and you put it all together and you say, God, how did they do this sort of thing? But anyway, that's what it is. So we have now the 7 largest fragments as we speak, and most of the gear work, by the way, is in the fragment A. In other words, they discovered about 30 gears, and about 21 or 22 are within this fragment A. And they, of course, you cannot see them because they are embedded into the gear alone. And so that's what I had to say, and I would be delighted to try to respond to some of the questions that you may ask.
Thanks, Steve. That was awesome. This is great. And I'll start with a question, which is, we already went through the aspects why this disappeared, and it seems very plausible that this may have looked as black sorcery of sorts to the newer civilizations that came after the Greeks, and they prosecuted. Were there other forms of these? Was this taught in school? Were there other forms of these instruments could have appeared in classical Greece during the Greek times and afterwards? Why this was so sudden? Why it has disappeared in such a dramatic way that it hasn't made to more recent times, only until recently, as you mentioned, the last 100 years or so?
If you change a culture as dramatically as Christianity did, And of course, Islam did the same destruction in the Middle East. And every place else Islam went and destroyed the indigenous traditions, just like Christianity. And if you do this kind of destruction, people are scared to death. They don't talk to each other. The schools are closed. The books are absent. So it takes centuries to recover some kind of knowledge. And what happened in this case of this device, it was more or less wiped out, not completely, but in the 8th to the 10th century, the Muslims in Baghdad, this is interesting. Now, this is in itself an exception to what I just said. That is, the Muslims in Baghdad, they had a caliph who somehow had fallen in love with Greek science and technology. So he sent his agents to medieval Greece, what historians call Byzantium, and they bought or they got copies of the surviving Greek philosophical and scientific works, like the works of Archimedes, like the works of Hipparchus, the works of Aristotle. And they took them to Baghdad, they translated them into Arabic, and then they began to deal with this kind of questions. So the Arabs, as a result of this advanced knowledge of the Greeks, they themselves advanced the science of optics, for instance, the science of medicine, and so on. And then because the Arabs and Muslims had Spain, they were occupying Spain for 800 years, in Cordoba, Spain, they had schools and they had libraries, just the Greeks did. And therefore, some of the Greek knowledge was moved from the Greeks to the Arabs to the Europeans in the 13th, 14th century. And then finally, the other dramatic event that happened was in 1453, the Mongol Turks took over all of Greece. Remember, the Western Christendom, we have to talk about Christendom, was divided. They had excommunicated each other. Western Europe had excommunicated Eastern Europe. So without excommunication, the discussion stopped. The Europeans lost their knowledge of Greek. They could not read Greek, they couldn't speak Greek, and vice versa. The Greeks could not speak Latin and so on. So it was this problem. But in 1453, the Mongol Turks took over Greece. And what happened during that upheaval, the Greeks who had Greek books from their ancestors, they ran to Italy. They carried loads of books, the books that we have today. They took them to cities like Padua, Venice, Florence, Rome. And there, the Italians were so well-to-do by that time that they figured maybe we should study Greek. So Greeks were there to teach them Greek, and they started teaching them Greek. And they started translating the Greek into Latin, because Latin was the lingua franca of Western Europe. And as a result of that Renaissance, they discover Archimedes, and as a result of that, you have a guy like Galileo Galilei would not have been Galileo without Archimedes, because Archimedes, one of the other things he did, he created mathematical physics. And so did Hipparchus. Hipparchus created mathematical astronomy. All this Greek knowledge, therefore, came into Western Europe at the universities of Padua, Paris, Florence, Venice, and so on. And there they started, and they slowly came to the point that what we historians describe as the scientific revolution, with Newton and Galileo and all other great minds in Europe, that they recreated and advanced the knowledge beyond what the Greeks had ever done. And that's how we have what we have today. Our modern world today is a product of Greek knowledge and its transmission from the Arabs and from the Renaissance in Western Europe in the 15th, 16th century. And Americans, of course, are Europeans and so on. The picture you brought in, this is the fragments we have today. They have 82 fragments now. I showed you the first 7. Now these are all the fragments together, 82. Tiny little ones. So that's what happened, unfortunately, in upheaval. So sorts of disasters happened, and Dark Ages dominated the almost for 1,000 years. And regrettably today, with the nuclear bombs all over, we can easily return back to the Dark Ages. That's the fear I have now about the war in the Ukraine. You have Russia and the United States loaded with nuclear weapons. And in war, in general, reason is set aside. It's passion, deep passion, hatred, and weapons that dominate the day. And you only need to make one mistake. You don't need very far. They came to a close of a nuclear bomb exchange in 1962. This is the year I was in the United States already for close to a year. And I remember I was so terrified by reading the papers about what was going on in Cuba. So they can do the same thing now. And regrettably, dear President Joe Biden doesn't seem to care. He just forgot about climate change and everything else, and now he's pushing $50 billion in arming the Ukrainians to kill the Ukrainians and Russians, and vice versa, and so on. And the Europeans, by the way, you would think that the Europeans would have learned their lesson from the Renaissance and all this. No, they're doing exactly what they did in the Dark Ages. Oh, march in arms.
Now, what sounds to me, thanks, Eve, an interesting aspect, because you spoke before about the knowledge of the earth itself in terms of the soil and the plants, food, agriculture, and the relation, and that relation with the knowledge of the cosmos, because
that's a very good question. Okay, this is it. I spoke very briefly about the importance of the sun and the moon. And of course, the sun and the moon were terribly important. They continue to be terribly important. The sun, of course, is the provider of light and life. Without the sun, we would be nowhere to be talking to each other. And in addition to that, they believe all the stars in heavens were gods. The Greeks were not Christian. They were not Jews. They were not Mohammedans. They were polytheists. They have many gods, several gods. And in agriculture, one of the greatest gods was Demeter, who was the sister of Zeus, who was the chief god of the Olympus. And you had several other gods. You had Dionysus, who was the god of wine. And you had the son of Apollo called Aristeus, who was the god of honeybees. Listen to this, honeybees. The god of honeybees. He was the god of cheese making, the god of olive trees and collection of the olives, and cheese making, and in other words, the fundamental activities of rural people to survive. They had the divinity, they call him Aristeus. So all these gods were worshipped because they were supposed to be doing all sorts of things to help humans, plenty of harvest, at least a successful harvest, so that they could actually survive. Food was fundamentally as important as it is today, and the gods provided us a metaphysical existence, a metaphysical inspiration that if we do this, certainly we're going to be blessed by the gods. Just like today, Christians and Muslims doing the same thing with their own divine beings, Jesus, Muhammad, and so on.
Professor, I have a question. What metal is this device made out of, and would that have any effect on its functionality or anything of that sort?
Yeah, that's a nice question. It's bronze. Bronze was the material. Tin, a little bit of tin and bronze, so that gears would not create problems and break down as quickly as possible. But if you look at the gears today in the National Archaeological Museum, you can see that, first of all, they were in the water for 2,000 years. It's just, they're fragile wafers. But they did work very smoothly, and they did the work that they were proposed to do. One of the persons who has written the book about the book is a woman from England who used to be one of the editors of the magazine Nature. And she said in her book, which I reviewed, she said, this gear was designed just for the plaything of the rich people, so they can impress each other and they can maybe teach astronomy. And so I disagree with that, of course. I think this was a very practical device designed to inform people about what happened to their gods. After all, the sun and the moon and the stars were gods. Constellations were a bunch of stars together. And also, if you knew what the stars were doing, then you were more certain that your harvest would be okay, and therefore you would proceed. And not only that, but you have seasons. How do the seasons come about? Who has an impact on the seasons? The stars, of course, the stars. And the stars were intimate to human behavior. For instance, they would thought that if a man and a woman conceived a child, if it was conceived during the time that X stars was bright in the heavens, watch out. But if they did it at another time, then the boy or the girl would be intelligent and would have a good life, that kind of thing. So they studied the heavens very carefully, and it was just their whole life. It was not removed. They were not removed. They didn't have telescopes, but they had bright, beautiful skies at night, and you could see the stars, and you could see you almost thought that you could touch the stars, and they studied the stars continuously. And it wasn't just the Greeks. The Babylonians did the same thing. The Egyptians did the same thing. Indeed, the major astronomer, the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, who most likely supervised the creation of this, he borrowed data from the Babylonians because the Babylonians had much longer time to study the heavens. The difference between the Babylonians and the Greeks was the Greeks were theoreticians. They picked up the data and they tried to explain how does the data explain this phenomenon. So they used them in this case to create a machine for their practical needs. And by the way, predicting the eclipse of the sun and the moon was not just a curiosity. It had political implications. For instance, during the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century, Athens sent an enormous fleet to Syracuse. Athenians were fighting the Spartans and all the allies to the Spartans. So they wanted a rich place like Syracuse because it had tremendous wheat fields to grow wheat and so on, and Syracuse was very wealthy. So in the process of going, the Athenian army fighting the enemy, suddenly one evening the moon disappeared. So you had a lunar eclipses, and that terrified the army so much, so that the priests that were part of the army, they told the chief general, you better not move. Give us 3 weeks to do the proper sacrifices to the gods, especially to the moon. And by delaying, because of this unexpected event, the enemies of Athens had the opportunity to attack even more fiercely, and they smashed the Athenians. Now, this was just one of the many factors why the Athenians lost, but it shows to you how important it was for the Greeks to actually know the heavens. That is, in this case, to know why the eclipses took place and what happened to the moon. In other words, they thought this was a goddess, Selene, a goddess. Now, how can a goddess disappear? Same thing with the sun. I mentioned the brilliant period, the Renaissance, that was centered around Baghdad between the 10th and the 11th and 12th centuries. While they were doing this fantastic work from the 8th century down to the 10th century, that is taking Greek manuscripts, translated into Arabic, and then the scholars of Islam took a serious look at this, and they advanced some of the scientific knowledge that they got out of the books of Archimedes and so on. Meanwhile, East and West was divided already. You had the Fourth Crusade, for instance, in 1204, where you had the Westerners, that is, Venetians, Franks, French, and Germans attacking Constantinople, which was the center of the Greek state, meaning Greece or Byzantium. They went into the city of Constantinople and they behaved exactly like barbarians. They burned libraries, they destroyed statues, they did all sorts of horrors and abominations. It took the Greeks 50 years to get rid of them and recapture their capital, but the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, the Mongol Turks were surrounding Byzantium, and they kept fighting the Greeks, and eventually they came to the point that in 1453 they took the whole place. But in the 13th century, before this calamity happened, in the 13th century, the Mongols invaded the Middle East. They wiped out all traditions in the Middle East. They did horrendous destruction. And a Greek historian spoke about this Mongol invasion like a frozen river going down and freezing everything. There was nothing. All what the Arabs had done in Baghdad with the Greek knowledge and science, all was wiped out. Libraries were burned, murder. There was just a mayhem. And this is why the Middle East lost so much out of this horrific experience with the Mongols. And in Western Europe, of course, they kept beginning now to revive slightly because of the advantage they had in Spain through that is the knowledge that the Muslims had from the Greeks trickled into Spain and then into European countries. And then eventually the Renaissance happened because the Greeks out of Constantinople and Greece, they left loaded with books, and they brought them to Italy, and they were translated into Latin, and people began to read them, and therefore we have the scientific accomplishments of people like Galileo and Newton and others. But the Mongol invasion was definitely a great event in European and Asian history. It was one of the most destructive attacks ever accomplished. So the Middle East, that was completely full of knowledge because of the Greeks and because of the Arabs, and there was just most of that knowledge was wiped out.